So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to switch my camera down so that I'm on the other view, then you can see my hands, and I'm actually going to draw along with you. And this is the sketch that we're going to try and do today. And I'm going to do a screen share, so you'll be able to see the photograph that we're working from at the same time as my hands. So I'll talk very briefly about observing the moon first of all. So hopefully you can still see my hands and the piece of paper. Get rid of that sketch because we're going to do a new one. Now, first of all, the moon looks different every day of the month, and the lunar cycle, it takes just a bit shorter than a calendar month. And at the beginning of the lunar cycle, the moon is just a thin crescent on the right hand side. Then over the next coming 2 weeks, it grows and grows until it's a full moon. And then it starts to shrink again, and this is when the moon is said to be waning. And then 2 weeks later, you end up with a very thin crescent before dawn when that one's visible, and then we're back to a new moon that is invisible. The reason I'm telling you this is because if you're going to try and draw pictures of lunar craters, when the moon is fully illuminated, all of the features have been completely wiped out because there's just too much light there. So when you look at a full moon, it's great for looking at the darker regions called the seas, because ancient astronomers, when they first put a telescope on the moon, thought that there might be water there, but we now know, of course, that there is no liquid water there. And you can sort of see some ejecta rays from some of the bigger craters, but apart from that, you can't really see an awful lot. So the best time to look for a particular crater that's your favorite is when the kind of shadow and light boundary called the lunar terminator is very near to where the crater is, because that's when you get all the definition. Now, the crater that we're drawing today is one called Archimedes, and it's up here near these big mountain ranges on the moon. So if we zoom in here, it's this crater here that we're going to draw, but we're doing it from a picture taken with the telescope, so it's been flipped around a little bit. Now, this picture was taken when the moon was just past half lit, and you can see all this lovely definition. But I'm just showing you a picture of the same crater here when you've got a full moon, because suddenly you can't really see anything other than a little bit of a boundary. So that's why it's so important that when you're looking at the morphology of craters, that you do so when the moon is at a phase where you can actually see what you're looking at. So we're going to do a drawing of this crater now, and I'm going to do it step by step with you. Now, obviously, we're fairly short on time today, but if you want to do this and take more time, you can put loads more detail in. But it might seem a bit daunting when you first start drawing the lunar crater. But the first thing you need to do, you can use any pencil, but I'm using a 4B because it shows up better on my camera, then you can see what I'm doing. So this crater is almost a circle. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of lightly draw. It's not a perfect circle, none of them ever are, because they've been formed by something huge hitting the lunar surface, so they're not going to be a perfectly round shape. Once you know kind of how big the crater is, and don't be tempted to do it too small, because the bigger you draw this, the easier it actually is. If you break down this photograph, you can see there are some really bright white bits kind of over this side, and then there are these really dark shadows. So the first thing I like to do is just draw a rough outline of where these white bits are and these little bits that are sticking out at the side here, because we don't want to colour those in, because once you've coloured them in, you'll have to rub all the pencil out again, and that'll be a bit of a nightmare to do. So it's easier if you just don't draw it in the first place. So all I'm doing here is just very roughly marking out where the white bits are, and then we're going to do some of the shadows first of all. So just kind of work your way around, and you'll notice that there are lots of uneven bits. There's lots of interesting nooks and crannies. Don't worry about getting absolutely every tiny detail correct. If you've got time and you want to sit and do a real piece of art, you can do that. Okay, so if you mark out those really white bits there, once I start colouring in the shadows, it will actually look a little bit better. So there was a little bit down here that kind of came out in a sort of L shape, so we'll just mark that out so we don't colour it in. And there was a little notch over here which again, you're not going to colour in. Then over on this side as well, there were some kind of brighter bits, which we'll just kind of draw a rough outline of that so that we don't then colour that in on the next step. So if I just go back to big screen there, then you can see the crater itself. The next thing we're going to do is just mark out these really dark shadows. And if you look along here, you can see the shadow is not a uniform height all the way around, and that's because the side of the lunar crater is not the same height. It looks like it is from above, but it isn't. So when you draw this line here, just make sure that you are kind of following roughly the pattern that that shadow is forming. And by studying this, we can learn a lot about the lunar landscape, and scientists even measure these shadows to calculate the height of those things on the moon and also on cameras on other spacecraft. So we're going to colour that in a second, but before I do that, just look on the right hand side here as well, and you can see that there's all these other really dark regions too. So we just kind of roughly follow the shape of that shadow. That goes a bit jagged there. And if this isn't perfectly accurate, it doesn't matter. You get more accurate the more of this you do. So if I just flip back to my hands again, what we're going to do is colour in this shadow. Now, if you don't have a very dark pencil, you can kind of colour it in two different directions, kind of like cross hatching, which is a really good technique for artists to use to build up a darker colour. Now I'm using a 4B pencil, so it's quite dark already. Don't worry as well if you can still see pencil marks, because these are pencil sketches. And if you look at sketches Galileo did, you can see all of the pencil marks where he scribbled stuff in. And I think that's what makes a sketch really pretty. And the other thing as well is that your sketch will not look the same as anybody else's sketch, and that's absolutely fine. As we all do these sketching workshops at Solar Sphere, and everybody's picture looks like the photograph we're working from, but no two people's sketches look the same as each other's. And that's great because everyone has their own drawing style. So I'll go over here and colour this shadow in as well. We're going to blend this in a second, so it'll get rid of a little bit of the pencil marks if you want to do that. Now, the shadow on this side as well is also telling us the shape of the crater wall on this side. And say when you see a picture of a crater on the moon without these shadows, it looks like the crater's the same height all the way around, but it really isn't. And they're actually, if you look at a picture of a crater, they're all just basically made up of some very dark bits, some very light bits, and bits of grey in between. So although our picture is looking quite complicated, when you break it down and do it this way, it's actually quite easy to do. And you can keep it really simple as well. A lot of artists will sketch like this at a telescope eyepiece, so you don't want to be sat there for 3 hours on a sketch if you're out in the cold looking through a telescope. So this is good practice from a photograph, and if you practice at getting fast at doing this, you'll be able to do it at the telescope eyepiece. So if that little bit here needs to get coloured in as well, and then I'm just going to use a cotton bud. You can use your finger, but make sure when you blend this, we're just going to blend it a little bit so we get rid of some of the pencil lines. And the beauty of pencil is if when you're blending it, you manage to rub it over some of the white bits, you can just use the corner of a rubber to rub it out again. So don't worry too much if you end up with some rough edges. You can always tidy it up. That's the beauty of doing this in pencil. So this pencil's a 4B, so it's quite soft, so it blends very, very nicely. So that's that side, and I'm going to blend this little bit as well, just so it's a bit smoother. So you don't have to blend it. If you like the pencil strokes, that's absolutely fine, and I think some of the pencil strokes do look good. So we've already got something that's starting to look quite three-dimensional, and all we've done is coloured in one black bit and a little bit of the white bit. So if I share that picture again now, what we're going to look at next is, they're called craterlets. They're tiny little craters on the floor of the crater. All they are a black circle with a kind of white bit round one side and a grey bit round the other. So if I just colour the centres in, and then I'll come down to my hands and show you what I'm doing. So all these little things are here. You've got a black bit because they're deeper and the sunlight isn't getting to them. The sun is kind of shining from the left side here, so that edge on that side is being illuminated a bit, and then this side here would just be a tiny bit darker. But you can really just leave these looking like little donuts, and once you colour the rest of it in, it will still look very three-dimensional. So that's the little craterlets done, and I wanted to do those first so that we don't then colour over them and have to rub out a tiny little section. So the next thing I want to do is just get the shape of this inside edge here where the white bit finishes, and you can see it's not a smooth edge, so we can just do some little markings on the inside there to show where that finishes. But as well as that, there are some other kind of grey textures just where the crater wall is slumped down a little bit, so you can mark some of that in and colour it in a little bit because it's still quite pale. You don't colour it in solid, you just kind of do little wiggly lines on it, and that will just give you the impression that that is a little bit darker than this bit here, but you've still got this little bit on the crater floor. So the next thing I'm going to do is just kind of basically fill in that middle section. And if you look, it's not a perfectly uniform flat grey colour, but it's darker than this bit, not as dark as this bit. So the way that I go about doing that is with my pencil on its side and just hardly pressing on at all. You can just kind of pencil on the side gives you a softer pencil stroke. So we'll just go through that and fill that in. So I'm hardly putting any pressure at all on the pencil here. It's a lot easier to build it up and make it darker afterwards than it is to try and rub it out because you've coloured it in too dark. Now make sure you don't colour in those little donuts that we've just filled in, and just take that shading up to the inner edge that we've just drawn. So yeah, just gently on its side. Then if you want to go back with it going the other direction, that will make it just a little bit darker grey, and because the pencil's moving in two directions, you get that kind of cross hatching which shades it really nicely without having to do loads and loads of blending. And there's no part of the moon that is a perfectly uniform colour. If you study the floor of a crater, there's always little bits that are darker, little bits that are lighter. So having some pencil strokes on here like this is fine. So I'm just going to use a clean side of my cotton bud now and just very quickly rub over that just to blend it a little bit. I'm not worried about it being completely perfect. Just want to blend that in a tiny bit. So now we've got something that's looking even more three-dimensional. So for the next step, if we look at this again, we need to do some work on this left-hand side of the crater. You can see that the terrace here is a little bit higher and then it slopes down onto the flat ground. Now, you don't need to agonize over getting every little speck in the right place here, but if you can just mark out this outer edge and just look at the shape that this is making, and then it comes down into a V shape down here as well. And all of this is just really textured kind of region. So if we just kind of roughly outline the shape of where that is, because that is a little bit lighter than the floor below it. And then it kind of comes down off the bottom of the drawing there, and that all connects up to this bit around here as well. You can see it's kind of all the same sort of texture. So there's a little bit of a shadow here that I'm going to quickly fill in, just another kind of dark sausage that joins onto that one. So colour that in first, just so we don't have to rub that out afterwards. And then that just kind of carries on round like this. So the way that I like to do that sort of texture is to just get my pencil and just kind of do random wiggly lines, just all you're doing is giving the impression of the texture. You don't have to agonize, as I said, over every single little bit being perfect. You can if you want to, and I do that. There are a lot of my photographs that I work from. I will spend ages trying to replicate every little bit that I can, but there's really no need to. You can keep it a lot more simple. As long as you've got the basic dark bits and light bits in the right places, then you're fine. It will look really good. So just kind of doing random scribbles here to just give the idea of that texture. We'll come back to the photo in a minute and fill in any kind of darker bits there. So I'm not pressing on very hard here, but I'm just kind of randomly scribbling. It's quite good fun. Okay, so that's that bit. Now, if we go back to the picture now, we can see that after that, it's a quite smooth kind of surface. There's this little dark bit here that I'm going to just add. This is sort of L shape that's shadow. And anywhere that you've got a bit of shadow and then a bit of light afterwards, it all just sells this idea that this is a three-dimensional drawing. So there we go, that bit there. So for this outline, we're obviously not going to colour in the entire page, but what I like to do is, again, just with my pencil on its side, just kind of do very light scribbles, because I like my sketches to just fade out at the edges rather than filling the whole page, because otherwise you can get bogged down with doing the entire lunar surface. And it's the same over on this side as well. So I'll flip back to my hands, then you can see what I'm doing. But around all of these edges, I'm just doing kind of straight pencil lines to just kind of fade it all out, because all the rest of the surface away from those kind of jagged bits there are all a very similar color and a similar texture. And I think it just looks really nice when you just start to fade that out around the edges. And I don't bother blending this. You can just do this. You can spend a bit longer on it and make it all very even. But I think just doing those edges just make it look really pretty. And it fades it out and shows that you're doing a picture just of that crater. Doesn't matter what else is going on beyond that picture. Okay, so we've now got something that's looking even more three-dimensional. One of the things that I like to do when I'm doing these sorts of sketches is to look at what's going on just beyond the crater. And here you can see that there's another little crater. And what's really good, because the sun is coming from the same side, the more things like that that you put around the outside of your crater, the more it kind of sells this idea that the sun is coming from one side, and it just makes your whole picture look even more three-dimensional than it already does. All this crater is a black circle with a white edge here, which we can use the edge of the rubber to just get rid of some of that cross-hatching. And then there's a bit on this side that's grey, but not quite as dark as the bit in the middle. And all you've done there, if I just come back down to my hands, all that you've done there is just add a circle with a white oval and a grey oval. But because the highlights are on the same side as the main crater, it starts to make it all kind of come together and look like one big three-dimensional object. So there's a few other bits that you can do to finish off the crater. So if I just go back to the picture again, there are some tiny little bits on the surface inside here that are just a bit darker. So you can go in and just shade some of those in. And there's a little bit over here as well. Now, because we're working from a photograph here, there's a lot more detail in this picture than you will ever see if you're doing this at the eyepiece. So you can keep this really simple and it'll be good practice. But anywhere around the outside edge where you've got like really obvious kind of dark dots, you can put those in, and it all just kind of adds to the depth of the sketch. And when you've got the time, you can actually spend a really long time going through this. Now, this white edge that we marked out isn't pure white. There are some other little bits in it. So I'm just going to go through there and just add little dark bits where you can see there's little nibbles taken out of that little bit of the lunar surface. There's a little dark bit here, and you can just kind of spend your time going around and adding all of those little details. And the more of that you do, the better the picture will look. But if you don't have time to do that, or you don't want to do any more than that, it's fine to leave the picture exactly as it is, because it looks really good. Now, I spent a long time doing a picture of this crater, which, I took a lot of time going through every little extra bit around the outside edge. And this picture, because of trying to get a webcam to not overexpose a white page, is very difficult to see what I was just doing. But if you can see on this picture, I've taken the time to just go around and add all of these extra features within the white areas, some extra bits on the floor of the crater. And if you take your time and go through and do all of that, you'll end up with a really pretty sketch. Now, the principles that I've shown you there, you can actually adapt for any sort of lunar sketching. And this is one that I did from a full moon picture. And when you look at the moon with the naked eye, it's really, really easy to see all of these features without any telescopes. You can just look at the moon with your naked eye and see these seas, and you can see the craters and the ray paths. If you look at the moon through binoculars or a telescope, you see even more of that. But if you are drawing the entire moon, you follow exactly the same principle. Just draw a circle, mark out where the really white bits are, kind of just around the edges, colour in where all the lunar seas are, and then you can go through and start marking out these big craters with the ray paths. And what I do is just get the corner of a rubber and just kind of sweep up through the sketch to get these rays coming out. All these rays are a material where something hit the moon and it's just forced all the material to get ejected out. Another thing that I like to do, if you have access to it, is doing stuff on pastels, with pastels on black paper. And I just find this is really, really good, because the background of a picture when you're doing moon sketching is usually black. The sky behind it, if you're looking at night, is always really dark. So having white pastel pencils, you can kind of make the grey colours really easily, but then you can use a black pastel pencil to really mark out these shadow areas. And pastels just blend so beautifully. So you can spend like 5 minutes doing a sketch in pastels, or you can spend 3 hours doing one. Either way, you will end up with a really pretty sketch. So if any of you at home do have pastel pencils, please do have a go at doing this. You can do it on blue paper or black paper, and it will still look absolutely beautiful. And one of the very early female astronomers that did some amazing lunar sketching with pastels is somebody called Maria Clara Imart. So definitely go and check her out online, and she will show some absolutely gorgeous pictures. Now, you can use these same principles to draw any astronomy object. So you can do this with deep sky things, you can do star clusters. It's all exactly the same principle. Just mark out the bright areas, mark out the dark areas, and then just start filling in the bits all in between the two of them. So I hope that was helpful. I've got some time to just go if anyone has questions about this, because I whizzed through this very quickly because I didn't want to run out of time. I'll switch my camera back over. So yeah, it's very hard to get the webcam not overexposing on your hands. So sorry for flicking between the screens.
That was absolutely brilliant. And you got a really good feedback on there. People are trying it out at home. Maybe the first time they've tried it out, so not always, quite as good as yours, but 2 huge blobs on the Earth's crust is what one person described it as. And they said theirs looked a bit like Dennis the Menace. But they're doing great, Mary. So I'm sure with a little bit of practice, but I want to ask you something. I love the little nibbles out of the sun, out of the crater, by the way. And a lot of them have said they absolutely love art. They like science, but they absolutely love art. Mary, I want to ask you, how did you get interested in astronomy?
I loved astronomy since I was a child because my mum was a child of the Apollo era. So she was obsessed with the moon because when she was a child, she sat up at night and watched the moon landings. So she was always obsessed with the moon and always pointed the moon out to me. So that's how it started. Then we had a set of encyclopedias at home that had star maps in and some of the beautiful space art by David Hardy. And when we hadn't visited these other planets, David Hardy is an amazing space artist who draws what he thought other planets and moons around other planets might look like. And seeing those artistic impressions really captured me as a child and made me want to be able to draw the universe, but also learn more about it as well.
So was it the astronomy first, or was it the art first, or was it both together for you?
For me, it was the astronomy first, although I did always do art at school and I did an art GCSE. I never really thought about doing space-related art. But when I started astrophotography, anyone that's done this will know you can get very obsessed with getting the perfect picture. And I became so obsessed with the photography that I didn't look at an astronomy object for over a year. And that's the whole beauty of astronomy, is that you look at things through binoculars or a telescope. So I thought, I am going to just start drawing Jupiter every night, plot where the Galilean moons are just with a small telescope. And from there, I then thought, I'm going to have a go at drawing the moon as well, because when you have to draw something, you have to study it properly. When you take a picture, you take a photograph, put it online, you don't study it. You never look at the shape of the crater shadows. You don't take any notice of what the picture actually is. It's all about having a pretty picture. But when you draw something, you've got to study it so carefully and in so much detail. And once I started sketching the moon, I started to suddenly learn all the names of the craters. I can recognize the craters from a photograph at any lunar phase. And it really does help to build the knowledge.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a big connection there between the science and the art, because the artist needs to study those things very carefully in order to be able to draw them, like you've just been drawing amazing pictures of the craters on the moon. And as you said, I love your pastel ones as well. But also a scientist has to study those things very carefully as well, and look in and try and understand in detail what they're seeing, how they're formed and things like that. So that being able to observe very carefully. With a photograph, you take a photograph and it can be a very beautiful photograph. I mean, photography is very artistic in itself, but actually being able to draw it. And I think in the olden days that the astronomers, maybe they didn't have cameras or Galileo did a lot of drawings, didn't he?
He did.
He drew, I think, maybe he drew the moon and he drew the planets that he was seeing as well, and he drew sunspots as well. Well, you never look at the sun. So in days gone by, I mean, and also all the botanists, all the people that travel different places, they would have to draw all these detailed pictures of the plants and things, because I don't think they had the cameras in those days, or maybe they couldn't even get the detail there. I don't know.
No, well, I actually am a trained biologist. I used to work in research, and I love microscopes, and I have 2 microscopes at home. And one of the things I really want to do is draw some microscopic observations as well, because there was a guy called Hook who was a famous microscope biologist in days gone by, and his drawings are phenomenal. They are so detailed and so beautiful. And ever since I saw a talk about Hook's Micrographia book, I need to draw some stuff from a microscope as well. And because again, I take photos and videos through a microscope, but I never study properly and actually draw things. So it's on my to-do list, is do some microscope drawing as well.
Oh, that's amazing as well. And you can learn so much with a microscope as well as with a telescope.